Morning.
Hey, hi everybody. This is Joanne, Manaster, and I'm sitting here in Illinois, surrounded by an ocean of corn, as usual, and in the summer anyway. And I am joined by my co-host Jeff, who is over in Maryland. And today we have as our guest Cynthia Barnett, a returning guest. We are so happy to have Cynthia back with us. And she has written a new book. Her last book was Rain, and that was great to read. So that's why we were so excited to have a new book by Cynthia. This one is called The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans. And it's a really well put together book about different shells and, of course, some history and anthropology, etc. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. It's nice to talk to you both again.
Did you go to Palau? Or did you you went to Palau, so you were so close. So yeah, it's funny how
so close. I actually had to stop in Guam.
You did.
I think you have to stop in Guam sometimes. On the flight I was on, we had to stop in Guam. And I wish I had gone to Guam. My greatest regret is that I didn't go to Japan, because that story is really, really important. Hirohito was a great marine scientist and a shell lover. And the World War II story to this book is really important in a lot of ways. One of them is that it was all those American servicemen stationed in the Pacific Islands who came back with these beautiful tropical shells as keepsakes. That is the thing that caused the American shell madness of the 1950s. Right. And there was a crazy shell madness. If you read the Junonia chapter, there is just, it was just wild. People were, opening shell clubs all over the country, including in the Midwest. And just, everyone was crazy about shells and putting them in the mail to each other. There were all of these mail order catalogs, but that, you can imagine those young men going to these tropical islands and finding these shells and just and bringing them home. And then, then there's also a prosperous time in the United States that follows that period that enables people to travel. So I write about Anne Morrow Lindbergh there too. And what's important about her to me, and I didn't realize this until I reread The Gift from the Sea. She, in the 1950s, is talking about the culture of accumulation, and she's warning us about it. And when I read that book when I was young, that went right over my head. I was reading it for the feminist themes that are in themselves very gentle, compared with our Me Too era of feminism. But when you read her on the amassing culture, she's talking about seashells, but she's really talking about something else. She's saying, it's okay to collect one seashell. One moon snail there's only one moon in the sky. I think she says she loves the look of one moon snail instead of three. She loves the look of one shell on a windowsill rather than a windowsill jammed with shells. And she's really saying something else about the culture we were becoming, right? And that was really interesting to me. And I think it's nice to think about that. She was saying, in framed space, beauty blooms. And I think that's a way to think about where we are as a culture and the transitions that we need to make to alternative fuels and the other places we need to get to. It is not a hardship. It's a better way of living. It's more beautiful. And so I tried to get that across in her part. I hope it comes across.
It does. It was very nice.
And it's a sort of anti-bouillabaisse philosophy.
You caught the bouillabaisse, Jeff.
Yeah,
sure. That's very modern sounding,
Yeah. So, the bouillabaisse metaphor, I could probably talk for a whole hour on bouillabaisse. And I I don't think I should give away this whole story.
Sure.
But I went back and read Yule Gibbons, and
Mhm.
some of your viewers may be too young to know Yule Gibbons, but he was
But I'm not.
Wild Foods before Wild Foods were popular.
Yes.
Right.
And he's sort of
Oh,
known
yeah.
for this sparseness, right? And living off the land and, eating wild leek soup and all these things. But when you read him on seafood, you realize that this is just, we've got to change our ethos. He would talk about,
yes.
he would be, raving about spearing octopus in their holes along the beach in California to eat octopus. And he talked about bouillabaisse, which is still a popular thing, I think. But a bouillabaisse is a dish that takes a crustacean, a fish, and shellfish together. But Yule Gibbons said it was no good unless you use 3 shellfish, 3 crustaceans, and 3 different kinds of fish.
More.
It's just more and more and more and more. And that was our culture. And I think we're in this transition, and this is a good thing. It's not, it's the future that we have to look at with a little less, with eating, maybe a farmed clam, which I still really like to eat. I actually quit eating some of the seafood I eat after this book, but maybe eating a farmed clam instead of a bouillabaisse is a better dinner. Maybe it's yummier.
Well, our idea of what it means to live off the land has changed so much since the 60s, maybe more into living with the land it does feel transitional. I hope it is.
Yes. And I think here on Nantucket, it's a very important part of the story, because the scallops have really been devastated here, the wild scallops. And it's not one thing, right? It's not just over harvesting.
No.
It's not just pollution.
I live very near the Chesapeake Bay, so that's an ever-present
thing. So it's very, very much warming as well. Warming is very relevant to these animals. So it's not just going to be one solution either. It's not just going to be, let's all eat aquacultured clams and scallops, which I believe will do, and I believe is an important part of this solution. But it's also, let's make these transitions that we need to make away from fossil fuels and toward alternative energy and these other things we're getting to finally. It's a really combination of things, just as it was a combination of actions that harmed the seas and the life in the sea.
Right, and we're like depleting past shells and current shells. And as a biologist, I did appreciate where you were talking about, okay, why can't we get more conchs to mate? And what's going on here? In fact, it was repeated over and over with many species of mollusks. Why can't we get them to mate? And there was a mixture of warming waters. They're too dispersed.
Yes.
If you've taken away a bunch, then there's one here and one here and one here. It's not close enough.
Yes. The chemicals had a huge impact on some of the animals, including murex. I will say that I was in Puerto Rico last week with one of the researchers in the conch chapter, Megan Davis. So there was one trip I didn't get to take because COVID was just starting as I was finishing, and I didn't get to go to Puerto Rico to see her conch farming operation. And conch farming is pretty promising. The great thing about it is that they have the fishers themselves. So the conch fishers, and this is a long time fishing economy in Puerto Rico. The conch fishers themselves go out and gather the eggs. So they will pick up a beautiful queen conch, take half the eggs, and then put her back on the rest of her eggs. Bring the eggs back to this area called the Naguabo Conch Hatchery, and there they can grow up much more of those eggs into larvae and then into queen conchs than they would have a chance of living in the wild, and then they will all be placed back into the sea. And because conchs are deep water animals, can be deep water animals, it's a little more promising, even if it gets any warmer than it already is there. So there's a bit more hope to that story than there is to some of the other shellfish stories. And, you know, I'm writing a story about that now. I'm kind of completing that story, so I'm excited about that. But you may have seen just last week with this incredible heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, you know, a couple hundred people lost their lives, and millions of shellfish, you know, that were living on the rocks in British Columbia. You just see those incredible photographs of dead mussels and see the impact that heat is having on us and on marine life and also on our food.
Right. Yeah, that was pretty startling.
Yeah.
And I think for some reason you're talking about issues in the ocean. Of course, plastic had to come up.
Oh, yeah.
And I was actually surprised to start hearing, some plastic is being now interwoven within the shells, and we'll be able to, some researcher in the future will look, oh yeah, this was that part of time when they just
What amazed me, Joanne, is that there is no part of the world where a malacologist has opened up a bivalve and not found plastic.
Right.
No part of the world, and that includes polar regions where there are no people whatsoever. But the fibers from our yoga pants are in those mollusks. And I just want to say one more thing about Nantucket while I'm here, thinking about it. Nantucket has banned single-use plastic. You cannot buy it on this island. And that was, you know, that was amazing. And that it took a while, but it went into effect. I think it's been in effect at least a year now. And, you know, everyone is getting by just fine without single-use plastics here. You can't say that anyone in Nantucket is suffering. Because they don't have plastics, right? So, yeah.
So
they're things that can change.
They're hanging in there. And actually, jumping back just a little to the more and the everything, I went looking up pictures of some of the shells that, you know, I've seen many of them by living on Guam. It all starts off with where you can buy shells, buy these shells, buy. And I was like, really? You know?
Yeah. So
big shell market.
Yeah.
Someone asked me, is there a big shell, like a big oil? And I wouldn't describe it as a big shell. The other thing people have asked me, which I have to admit I'm surprised by this question, and it tends to come from younger people, like my students' age, is it even okay to pick up a shell anymore? Given what we know about the world, and given that we know hermit crabs use them, and that hermit crabs are mistaking plastic for seashells all over the world and dying inside plastic, is it even okay to pick up a shell? And I would say that it is okay to pick up a shell, and that it's maybe even important to pick up a shell, especially if you're with a child, and that's, you know, that child is getting some connection to nature, and maybe we'll take it home to the Midwest or wherever they live. But maybe it's okay not to pick up every shell on the beach. Maybe you pick up one shell, like Anne Morrow Lindbergh said. But the way that ties into the sale of shells and whether there's a big shell is, you know, it's better to pick up a native shell on your beach, an empty shell, than it is to go into the beach shop at your beach and buy a tropical shell. Because that shell was very likely came somewhere from the Pacific Triangle, where the tropical shells are imperiled by over-collecting. And then it was shipped over here. The people who gather shells in the industry are also taken advantage of, and they need solutions, just like those conch farmers in Puerto Rico are being paid pretty well to collect conch eggs. There are sustainable solutions for fishers in Indonesia and elsewhere that are the answers, rather than, you know, being exploited to over collect tropical shells. So everything is connected. That's what I hope you took away from this book. I mean, I actually set out to listen to shells to see what they had to tell me about the earth and the ocean and its marine life, but they actually had more to say about people and how we live and how we treat each other. So, you know, sometimes as environmental writers and science writers, I think we're maybe too micro-focused on that animal doing amazing things instead of its connections to human history and our obligations and justice and things like that. So that's why the book spiraled around the world, even to the Maldives, and came back around.
Speaking of Big Shell, though, and I don't think we should tell the story here at all. It's fine. It's in the book. Here you go. But perhaps you can reveal the original name of Shell Oil.
Well, I can tell you what the company was originally. It was Samuel Marcus's Seashell Curio Company in the East End of London. Samuel Marcus was a Jewish shopkeeper in London who opened his shop in the 1830s.
In the East End, because you couldn't get better space if you were Jewish.
That's right. That's right. And he had a wonderful seashell shop. The shells that had been, I may have mentioned the earlier seashell craze among royalty,
for sure,
aristocrats. But then by the 19th century, that craze spreads to the Victorians, the Victorian middle class, and they all want to buy seashells. Marcus Samuel has the brilliant idea to import seashells to feed into that craze. And he imports beautiful seashells from Japan. And in the next generation, his son, Marcus Samuel Jr., founds the Shell Oil and Transport Company. And that is, as Jeff says, a pretty epic tale that I tell in a chapter called The Murex. And the first Shell Oil tanker through the Suez Canal was called the Murex.
And it is so nice to know that it does not take 10,000 dead Murex clams to make a microgram of purple dye.
Purple dye. Yeah, I was surprised in that chapter, like how, you know, she's following, as a woman, right? Following the instructions, like written instructions on how to collect dye from these shells.
She's following Pliny.
That's what I thought. Right.
And she's like, wait a minute, he never really made this dye.
Nice of him to document something he didn't do.
Exactly. Enslaved people were actually making that dye, so I think he glossed over it a bit.
And
there's more critical shell theory.
Right.
So he, you know, you're talking about the collecting dye, but the end of the book reveals some really cool possible science of the iridescence of these giant clams and how those could be helpful for solar power. So toward the end, you had asked me if I traveled to Palau, and I did. I traveled to Palau with Allison Sweeney, who's a biophysicist now with Yale, and she is actually studying the properties of giant clam illumination to understand it as a possible inspiration for alternative biofuels and solar energy. So clams are basically big biofuel plants sitting on the shallows of the Pacific, taking in, you know, billions of microalgae and fueling themselves with that food with the help of some sunlight. And so, you know, these animals are inspiring a lot of really fascinating science. So I write about that science, and of course, Megan Davis and the aquaculture part is another very important part of the solutions. And then another
another scientist I write about toward the end of the book is Mandy Holford, who is working on venomous mollusks as potential human cures. You know, they are working on molluscan toxins for everything from painkillers to cancer cures. She's actually identified a toxin from terabrid snails that can kill liver cancer in mice. And so she has a long way to go for human trials, but it's really amazing. So I wanted to show by the end of the book the extraordinary human ingenuity that is out there and underway, and this, you know, this shift that is happening. But we've got to protect the seas and, you know, stop climate change and stop contributing to climate change to get to these new ways of living and these wonderful innovations.
In passing, you noted that something like someone had told you that they estimated that in medicines and things that some 80% of antibiotics and other very useful drugs had biological origins. And
yes. And with mollusks are a relatively recent part of that. I think just in the last 40 years ago or so, most of these cures have come from plants and trees and the like. So the marine creatures, you know, everything from jellyfish to mollusks are really important.
A confession about that is that for a long time I thought it seemed kind of a thin justification on the part of conservationists, let's say, to say, well, we might find drugs in these plants and these animals and these mollusks and things, so we'd better be careful. It's like, well, yes, we might. And so as a specific thing, it seemed a bit thin, but I'm starting to see it in the same way seashells as metaphors for everything, that it's really a type of discussion that the things that we get via these drugs, which is a very specific, concrete thing that we can understand or relate to, is symbolic of a bigger. We don't even know what the resources contain and offer, and we don't appreciate them.
Yes, it's such a great point, Jeff. And I have often felt the same way you did. Sometimes when an environmentalist or a marine scientist will say, well, here's why we have to save the oceans. We might be, you know, there might be a cure for cancer there. It felt, mercenary is the wrong word, but I'll use that word. That word is too strong, but that's how it felt. But you're right. It's the symbol of the whole. And it's the important part is listening to nature. We have been so arrogant, right? That arrogance comes through in this book in so many ways. And it was also true of those medicines, right? The chemical companies would find something and then they would send it to the lab and try to make a synthetic version. They would spend a couple of years trying to make a synthetic version when the, you know, evolution had done it better. And that is what Alison Sweeney is saying about the giant clams. Let's listen to what nature has been telling us for, you know, a billion years, because we can live better with the help of the animal world. And so that's what it's about more than any one cure for any one thing.
Plenty of symbols like the just the picture of land developers plowing down ancient or historic unique resources of these shell buildings in order to crush the shells to make concrete to pave roads is a really powerful symbol. I think that's going to be with me for a long time. And it's so, I was so irritated by it.
It's so irritating. You know, the one that got me, Jeff, was that alligator effigy in Louisiana. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen that? There was a huge alligator effigy that was taken down to build roads. Just incredible.
Well, it was just some statue by some old people who weren't even very sophisticated.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, And speaking of destroying things or taking advantage of people, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Nagoya Protocol. Some people may or may not know about this. I'm a biologist, so I do.
Yeah.
The importance of these discoveries.
So the Nagoya Protocol was part of the Convention on Biodiversity to try and protect. So you heard, we talked a little bit earlier about some of these places where the shells get taken away, right? The shells are getting taken out. Those animals are being killed, but also animals, marine animals from the Coral Triangle and many other parts of the world, you know, such as the Brazilian forests. These things were being taken by major chemical manufacturers or by Western scientists to, you know, to come up with cures and do their work without regard for the people in those places. And there are some really painful stories when you look back at history about colonial science and what happened. So, you know, really important objects like you might remember that shells, things like wampum here in our country, but shells in other parts of the world, they weren't exchanged as money so much as truths and cultural artifacts. So many of these things were just taken by archaeologists, earlier archaeologists. It was the same in the ocean. You know, people were just taking creatures, bringing them back to the United States or to the EU and discovering things, and nothing would go back to the countries. There's a very dramatic quote in the book. I don't have it in front of me, but someone said, you know, the tropics were our supermarket. We could just take anything we wanted. And so the Nagoya Protocol was meant to prevent that from happening anymore. So it protects some of the smaller countries or more developing countries to be able to strictly control who can take their marine life and other resources. Well, the problem with it is that it's sort of backfired, so that now scientists who are doing some of this work, who are working with Native people and wanting to share this, you know, with all humanity, are in some cases being kept from doing the research they need to do. So it's still a very controversial topic, and it is not worked out. But I had one scientist tell me that it's the number one barrier to his marine science in the Pacific Triangle right now. So it's a very, you know, very current and timely issue, and it's got to, you know, it's got to be negotiated with people who live in these places, and not just, you know, not just by the bureaucrats and scientists and people who are paid to fly somewhere and be in a room.
Right. Yes, it's so true. You know what? I'm looking at your book. I have an ARC, so I don't have the full one, but can we give a shout out to your artist?
Absolutely. I am so glad you did that, Joanne. That's been something I've been doing on my Zoom book talks, has been showing her artwork. The artist's name is Marla Coppolino. She lives in Ithaca, New York. In her day job, she works for the Cornell Ornithology Lab.
Oh, I love that. Their app is great.
She is a trained malacologist, and she is a fantastic scientific illustrator.